I'd now like to welcome someone who's, I'm sure, very well known to many people in this room. And if you don't know Phil, you should get to know him before this couple of days is over. One of the genuine champions of genetic evaluation in the sheep industry. If you've looked in the notes there, you see he's not particularly biased about breed. He's got a couple of terminal sires, a multi-meat, high fertility composite, and some merinos as well running around on the farm down at Lucendale, where Phil and his family are based. So Phil, welcome you to the stage to give your perspectives about what you're doing in your business breeding for consumer. Thank you.
Okay, thanks Richard. Many of the speakers this afternoon have been speaking on pretty much what I thought I was going to speak about to some degree, so I'll perhaps just be reiterating most of the time. Right, well the first thing I thought of when I was given the topic was the old adage, the consumer is king. So what sprang to mind there is really there's a massive disparity in the understanding of differing production systems, leading to varied ideas about what is acceptable from the consumer perspective, and ranging really from the insane to the sensible. If you follow Facebook threads sometimes, you would sometimes wonder why you're even bothering, but we can't let that affect us. So who is our consumer? Are they local or overseas? If they're homegrown, then perception can be driven very much by media, and particularly social media. Export markets can vary from very wealthy, as we've seen before, and to low income. So, say a comparison would be USA to perhaps New Guinea. And they would have very different expectations from a cultural and ideological perspective. All right, from seed stock producer point of view, our immediate consumer is the purchaser of our rams. But I think we need to look further than this. The market is the final arbiter of setting our breeding objectives. The commercial lamb and or wool producer, from my perspective, must always be viable economically. Otherwise we just don't have an industry. And we hear much about sustainability all the time, and I tend to think that most people talk about sustainability in terms of environmental outcomes, but from my perspective, the financial outcomes are the first priority, and then the environmental outcomes are secondary, but they must be addressed. So our first priority then is to breed sheep which facilitate commercial producers to be profitable. For commercial producers, the genetic component of whatever genotype they choose to use is only one part of the package towards profitability. Whereas for us, as seed stock producers, we tend to think of just genetics. A commercial producer is certainly not thinking of just genetics. To give you an example, a producer could be perhaps running the very best genetics he can get his hands on, but still be unprofitable due to maybe low stocking rates, poor pastures and poor infrastructure, that sort of thing. And so the genetics are helping, but they can't carry the entire load. The opposite of this is a producer who runs quite average to even poor genetics, but because his whole system, his or her whole system is really, really good, they can still be highly profitable. So we tend to perhaps sometimes get a bit carried away about genetics. But that doesn't mean that we as seed stock producers should ever be complacent about that. We've got to keep kicking goals that way. As the commercial producer, as the ram breeders consumer, what else do we need to consider? I believe we also have to consider the processor requirements and the final consumer expectations. Currently, a lamb producer is paid pretty much only for the carcass weight of lamb. Sometimes there's a bit of fat. Well, on the kill sheets you get fat, but never paid for it. Whether it's ranging between, say, a 2 and as long as it's between 2 and a 4, you might get penalised above that. So seeing as lamb production is based around carcass weight and price, I think we ram breeders must provide animals that grow quickly and reach a desired carcass weight. Currently, this is a strong profit driver and likely to remain that way. The lamb processor has a number of criteria they like met, among which are a desired carcass weight range and a high carcass yield, which is driven by fat, bone and muscle ratios. So when we're breeding as seed stock producers, we need to think about these traits in the rams as we breed and work towards improvement in them. Finally, we come to the final consumer. We've heard a lot about these today. The actual consumer of the lamb must also be a very important part of our consideration, as they are a very important part of the equation. If the consuming public are not satisfied, then we have nothing. They have a number of considerations also, some of which are value, tenderness, taste, juiciness. So we've established that, or I've established hopefully that we really have three consumers, with our main one being the prime lamb producer. So I consider that our studs and many other studs too, I'm only talking really here about terminal production now, I think we've generally met the ongoing genetic challenge of providing size to industry which meet lamb producers' major objective of having fast-growing lambs. I also consider we've pretty well met processor concerns. We've also attempted to breed rams which have balanced traits for growth, muscle and fat, and this has been relatively easy with SG ASBVs for these traits. Our involvement up to about 15 years ago with the Limestone Coast Lamb brand also helped me to considerably to understand the type of carcasses that restaurant and small butcher trade were after. This group marketed around 100 lambs a week for about 10 years, but as with most small branded lamb groups, the challenges proved too high in the end and ceased trading after 10 years of business. In more recent lamb research, as we've continually heard today, is confirming that continued improvement in carcass traits is leading to slowly decreasing EQ traits, which our end consumer will finally push back against. The traits that make up EQ are difficult to measure phenotypically and can only be measured by samples taken from a carcass, which is expensive. This has led us to begin initially to use genomics in helping to select our next generation of ram lambs. We've belonged for a long time to two breeding groups, Meat Elite Australia and Super Whites, and Troy spoke a little bit earlier about Super Whites. And we've been with them since their beginnings, and this has helped us greatly in both our PD and White Suffolk flocks to keep genetic gain moving forward at a good pace and to keep these flocks within the top 20th percentile of their respective breeds. Both these groups embarked on a PIFT, or producer-initiated fast-track program, during 2017, and again Troy covered a fair bit of that just a while ago, where there was 4,000 lambs in 2017 tested in the Meat Elite group and 2,000, as Troy said, in the Super Whites group. The Super Whites group also had a little over 280 progeny slaughtered and measured for IMF and shear force. There were 55 sires represented in this cohort. What we learnt from this program is that we will need to do more carcass testing of progeny to improve accuracy of the genomic testing. This is a real challenge, and both groups are attempting to address how to go about this into the future. In the meantime, we're still very reliant on genomic testing alone, backed up by the resource flocks, where MLA can verify the genetics or genomics tests against the size tested in these flocks. It was interesting to see that the resource flocks are going to continue on for a few more years, so that was good news. Also, to keep our clients at home informed as to what we're doing to address these challenges, I've always written a short newsletter which is added to the invitation sent out prior to our annual on-property sale. And on speaking with clients, many are unaware of much of the genetic programs MLA are involved with, because it seems as if most of the target audience are seed stock producers, which you'd expect, but prime lamb producers in general don't seem to take much notice of what's happening at the research end, and maybe that's a big area to cover. One said to me one day, "Good, that means I don't even have to think about it so long as you're involved." So that was good. How we've integrated all this on farm. Firstly, I feel you need to have a very good set of sheep yards that are very functional. Where's the pointer on this? No, I don't know. Anyway, you can see up the blue thing up there. That's the sheep handler, and on the side of that there's an EID reader for all our pedigreed sheep, which run through when we run them through there. So recently we built a new shearing shed as well. Prior to this, we were operating in my brother's shed, and we used to also have our ram sale in there too. And you'll notice there that we've got a roll-in board there that on jockey wheels that you can bolt on, and that gives us extra width there to hold the sail in. And we also move it to another position to conduct our AI and ET programs too, so that it's all done up there. That's the internal setup. We use plastic grading at the rear end of the shed and wooden grading at the catching and force pens. I was a bit worried about the plastic grading because that floor there is 2 metres above the ground, and there's a lot of light under the grading, but the zigzag pattern in the plastic grading seems to negate it all, and sheep flow on it beautifully. So that was a relief, actually. We've EID'd all pedigreed animals. You can see the EID in the right ear there. Yeah, this makes tracking of our individual animals much easier and quicker, and has reduced errors. We do run about half of our DSE is commercial sheep, but none of those have got EID at this point. I can't actually find a use for them to be EID'd. We use genomics now, and that's helping us tremendously in the selection of our young rams in particular. And the other thing we're using now is mate cell. We have been using mate cell for probably four to 5 years. I was using a service provider to do this, but my son has now been trained in mate cell, and hopefully that's actually what he's doing today, because we're meant to be putting rams out for the rest of this week. And finally, we like to benchmark a lot. So sheep genetics really allows us to benchmark. We can benchmark against all other studs in the various genotypes, but we also benchmark financially, and there's nothing that inspires you more to get on with the job than doing those sort of benchmarking efforts. And that's it for me.
Thanks, Phil, for sharing your story with the group. So we've had a few thumbs in action, so let's work our way through the questions. Why do you think the industry was so slow to react to declining meat eating quality?
I don't think that they really understood there was a problem to begin with. And in reality, there's probably still not a problem at the moment. For most lamb still eats well. So, but as a seed stock producer, I think we need to have our finger on the pulse and be doing something about it. Which one are we on?
Let's just work from the top, Phil.
Do we have something
Something to
to
share about
on
your
them?
merino enterprise. So we've got a few merino people in the audience here who...
Well, I love my merinos, I'll say that. Always have, and they were our first breed of sheep, and I have no reason to change that. They're very profitable at the moment, so that's a very good thing too. So we have them fully onto sheep genetics. So measure as many traits as we can. That's the one thing. If you want to make an improvement in a trait, you have to measure it. It's as simple as that, and then get it analysed. So that's quite straightforward. The biggest benefits from using mates, well, it's the time. For me, I used to spend up to a week poring over Excel spreadsheets, working out my matings, and then I'd still get some wrong. And the other thing is that I would have some that were very closely bred and had very high inbreeding coefficients. So from that perspective, it's been excellent. But it also maximises the genetic gain across the whole flock, because I used to tend to just use the very top rams to the top ewes, and then the rest of them I just sort of had a scattergun approach, so it's improved dramatically from that. Time is the other thing. You can plug the data back into your Excel, your XR 5000 and auto draft on it, and so we could put out, we could separate up probably 700 ewes in a day. Mustering takes the biggest time, and then take them back to the paddocks in individual groups with the ram in a trailer behind them, and so it really simplifies that. Do our clients pay premium for rams with better eating quality? I'd say some do, not many at the moment. They certainly pay a premium for rams that have got growth and plenty of muscle and the right amount of fat. That's absolutely certain. In fact, I'd say nearly all of our clients really understand breeding values very well.
So just to expand on that comment, Phil, what do you think's been a key part of getting your clients on that journey? Because we know that some ram breeders struggle to get their clients to pay a lot of attention to the breeding values and the hard work they've done.
Initially it was having ram select workshops facilitated by Elkie Stevens, or Elkie Stevens as she was in those days, Elkie Hocking these days. So that helped, and also me just promoting it all the time to clients, like always putting something in the catalogue that related to breeding values, so that they get switched onto it. How did the branded lamb fail? Right, a couple of things. Size was one thing. The other thing was finding 100 quality lambs from different, say 10 or 15 different producers every week is not easy. And sometimes there'd be lambs slaughtered and sent that weren't quite finished, and you'd heard about it straight away. The butchers would be right onto you. And the other thing that I think really killed it off was it was at a time when skin prices were very high, and because we weren't getting slaughtered at the major works, we were getting slaughtered at small works, our skin prices we had to accumulate skins and then sell them, and they were getting paid out at about half what other producers were getting through their normal channels. And that meant that at the end of the day, the premium we got for our carcass meat didn't make up for what we lost on the skins, so we ended up the same. So, and then finally, the killing works we were killing at, they decided not to kill small stock any further, and so then we had to move to another works, which was a long way away, and so it just fell over at that point.
Just became too difficult.
Yeah.
So now looking at I guess you're a member of two genetic groups. You mentioned there, Meat Elite and Super Whites. The question around is how do those groups help drive genetic gain across so many flocks?
Well, it's a good question. You could certainly, I think it's just competition as much as anything. Everyone in the groups is competitive against each other. Even though we get on exceptionally well, we still we still compete against each other, and I think that's it. It's also that we're very like-minded, and we stay in close contact with researchers and geneticists who always speak at our conferences and that sort of thing. So that helps us enormously.
So stop one. That's a nice question to link the. You're talking about your genetic benchmarking and your financial benchmarking, and
right.
how you how they come together.
I'd say there's not. Well, there has to be a relationship, doesn't there? But it's hard to put a value on that. All I could say is that I know that our seed stock operations are about 2.5 times more profitable than our commercial operations. So that sums it up that way. But otherwise, no.
Very hard to draw those direct relationships. There's obviously a lot of other factors come into farm financial performance. So looking at your commercial flock, Phil, what sort of, how do you work on that in terms of the maternal performance?
How do I record you on your maternal performance? Well, we preg scan, so we know, particularly if we look at our crossbred ewes, we know which ones are dry, which ones are empty, which ones are having singles, twins and triplets, and we feed them differently, of course, for each group. I keep long-term, I've got records that go back 10 years on lambing percentages and so on with those, so that's the sort of record to keep. Really all we do with those ewes is if they're empty for 2 years, they go. But otherwise, we don't do a lot with those figures otherwise.
At that commercial level.
Yeah.
So looking at your selection pressure, I guess, in this sense, or the relative emphasis, how much do you place on the eating quality traits in your maternal and merino flocks?
Okay. In the merino flock, I'd say almost nil. In the maternal, because we haven't actually got a lot of information in terms of genomics on them, again, very little. It's just what shows up in the breeding values that are already there. That's purely a fact that because small maternal groups or breeds haven't had much uptake haven't been able to be tested really. So I saw the list that Daniel put up, I think it was Daniel put up, that it was pretty much just the major breeds. Yeah. So we haven't tested.
And Julius mentioned that work going on there to try and bring more of the numerically smaller breeds into that genomic capacity. So I imagine that's of interest to you from that perspective, Phil.
That's right. How do we incorporate it?
So how do you actually incorporate the eating quality traits in your selection process for sires?
Right, yeah. We tend to, we're using the LEQ index a lot these days, so we select first on that and then look at the individual traits and just see if they fit what we think they should be. So the initial selection is done using LEQ, and from there we then we might look at say 10 rams and isolate them out according to individual traits. Yep. So there's a good balance across the lot.
Mm-hmm. Make sure there's not rams in there that have a real extreme on one trait.
Well, that's right. I don't like to see
up.
Extremes in a breeding value. Mm-hmm. Unless you really need that breeding value.
Unless you're chasing that particular trait. Yes. Yeah. Very good. Well, I think that looks like it might bring us to the end, Phil, and that brings us in pretty much spot on time for the end of the day. So could you join me in thanking Phil for his presentation and discussion, please?